Hello everyone, I am Mustansar Siam from Lahore, Pakistan, and I am very pleased to introduce Professor Jean-Luc Maurer, who has joined me from Geneva, Switzerland, to discuss democratization in Indonesia. Professor Jean-Luc Maurer is a professor in development studies at the Graduate Institute Geneva and author of Indonesian Development from Dictatorship to Democracy. Thank you so much, Professor Maurer, for joining me.
My pleasure.
Okay, my first question to you is, what inspired you to write a book on democratization in Indonesia?
Well, since you know Indonesia also, you probably know that it is the most unknown of the large countries in the world, basically. Yeah, nobody talks very much about Indonesia. It is a discrete, big country. Yeah, I remind you that it is the fourth largest country in the world by its population, more than 280 million people. It is the largest Muslim country on earth. 80%, 87% of the population is Muslim. So that is more than 240 million. That is bigger than Pakistan, slightly bigger than Pakistan, bigger than Bangladesh, bigger than India, because India has a big Muslim population too, but it's around 200 million. It is also one can say probably the only Muslim democratic country in the world, together with Malaysia, neighboring Malaysia, which is close by. According to all the indicators well known by AEU or Freedom House, etc., Indonesia is a good classification. It is considered to be by AEU as a flawed democracy, but it is a democracy, whereas, for instance, your good country, Pakistan, is considered to be a hybrid regime. You know all these figures as well as me, I suppose, and the same goes for Freedom House. So after 32 years of not authoritarian regime, we will talk about this under General Suharto. It is a resilient democracy. In 1998, it turned to be a democratic regime with a number of years in turmoil, etc. But it is a democratic regime since 1998. So it means that it's celebrating its 25th anniversary as a democracy. And nowadays, by the time being, as we see in the world, it is a big success. Yeah, it is also a relatively successful economic and social development model, basically, since 50 years, because economic and social development took place under the authoritarian regime of Suharto and also under the democratic regime since 1998. And it is close to be, it is an upper level middle income country according to the World Bank. So it is a success story in terms of development. And one should not forget that it was the first country to declare its independence after from the colonial rule after the Second World War in 1945. And it fought for 4 years against the Dutch. The Dutch was the colonizer. It was a model for many countries, being the first one to declare its independence and fight for it. And at the same time, it was very active in the creation of the non-aligned movement. Bandung Conference in 1955, of course, was the departure point of this. And as we see now, with the war between Russia and Ukraine, non-alignment is back on the fore, basically, with a large majority of countries from the global south refusing to take sides. You know, so it's a new form of non-alignment, but at the origin, Indonesia was there. So all these reasons brought me to write this book. And of course, the last one is that, as you can see, I'm already an old man. I have retired since about 10 years. I'm an honorary professor. And it was a good way for me to put a final end maybe to my academic career by publishing this book on Indonesia.
Okay, thank you. What were the key features of Sukarno's guided democracy, and how did it shape Indonesia's political landscape during its time of implementation?
Okay, so the guided democracy that Sukarno inaugurated in 1958 after basically a decade of an attempt by Indonesia to adopt the democratic regime, which created a lot of uncertainty, basically, and a lot of instability, basically, government changing, very often. Sukarno imposed this so-called guided democracy, which is a sort of semi-authoritarian regime aiming at overcoming this political instability and also the economic glut, the economic stagnation that was going with it. The country being in this situation since its independence in 1945, Declaration of Independence, but really in 1949, because for 4 years there was an independence war against the Dutch, and in fact it was only in the early 50s basically that Indonesia started to really be really independent. So the key features of this presidential regime were that it was more authoritarian, with a limited role of the parliament, basically, and it was a presidential regime where the president was basically the key figure, and Sukarno was the father of Indonesian independence, and for all these years, he played this role. The main result of that was that there's been a strong political polarization during these years between the Nationalist Party, which was the party of Sukarno, which was allied to the Communist Party of Indonesia, which was a very big party. It was the third largest communist party in the world after China and USSR at that time. So there was on the one side this alliance of nationalist and communism on the one hand against an alliance of conservative Muslim political parties of different tendencies, but with the army, basically. So there was these two camps, you know, between 58 and 65 that were really fighting, and there was a strong political polarization, which unfortunately, at the same time, there was economic stagnation. The economy was not really taking off. There was a decline. There was a lot of problems with the food deficit. Poverty was increasing, etc., etc. So all this ended, unfortunately, in October 1965, into a big clash between these two sides of the political life in Indonesia, which resulted in the killing of 500,000, maybe more than that. We don't even know today exactly the figures of 500,000 people close to the Communist Party or supposed to be communist. And this also, you know, is the fact that I was telling you that I wrote this book because Indonesia is pretty unknown. In fact, the world has forgotten about this huge Holocaust that took place in 1965. Things have been worse since then, you know, as well in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge regime, or in Rwanda with the genocide of the Tutsis. But in fact, in these years, it was the largest humanitarian crisis and killing after the Second World War, basically. So this has been also, unfortunately, a bit forgotten. In spite of that, one should recognize that the role of Sukarno has been very crucial for Indonesia. He was the father of independence. He fought for it for 2 decades. He was jailed, and he had all sorts of problems with the Dutch. And he was a very a very important thinker, philosophical thinker, one could say, because he invented this concept of Pancasila, the 5 principles that is the state ideology in Indonesia. I don't go into the details here, but I just mentioned here for your for the people listening to you that the first of these principles was belief in one God. It was belief not, you know, it was not Sharia. It was not, in spite of the fact that the majority of the population is Muslim, there's strong Christian minority, there's also Buddhist minority, Hinduist. The island of Bali has remained basically Hinduist. So the idea was there was a belief in God, not in God the Almighty and Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And probably this has allowed Indonesia to remain a unitary state because it is a very diverse state. As you know, it's a big archipelago, more than 13,000 islands, a lot of ethnic and linguistic and cultural and religious diversity. So this Pancasila is probably the asset on which Indonesia could remain a unitary state. So thanks this to Sukarno. At the same time, as I said, he was one of the founders of the non-aligned movement, and it has allowed Indonesia to remain away from being aligned with one or the other side during the Cold War, which is, of course, a situation that benefited the country, unlike, for instance, Pakistan or India, for that matter.
Okay. My next question is related to General Suharto. What were the key factors that allowed General Suharto to establish and maintain its authoritarian regime And what were the consequences of this regime for Indonesia's political and economic development?
Okay, so 1965, as I said, was a very bad moment for Indonesia, and Suharto emerged as the head of the army and took power in 1966, and he remained in power until 1988. So a long, time at the head of the state, 32 years. He established this so-called new order, which was a very authoritarian regime based on the army, basically, and suppressing basically really all political and civil rights. There was an enormous political repression, of course, at the beginning with the killings of hundreds of thousands of people and the jailing of them, but also all alongside this 32 years experience, there were frequent human rights violations. There was a sort of reorganization of the political life. In a sense, it was a sort of improvement of Sukarno's guided democracy, really sort of external, extreme authoritarian version of Sukarno's guided democracy. And the political life was reorganized along three coalitions: one governmental coalition, the party was called Golkar, and two other coalitions in which the traditional parties of Indonesia were regrouped. And there was an apparent democratic rule. It was a democracy according to some extent, because there were elections every 5 years. There was legislative elections, but the governmental party Golkar would always win by 2/3 to 3/4 of the vote, and the parliament was electing the president each time, and the only candidate was Suharto. So he was re-elected 7 times, as the president of Indonesia. So that was the way the political system was functioning. It was respecting some of the rules of democracy as far as the electoral process was concerned, but for all the rest, it was, of course, an authoritarian regime. At the same time, Sukarno was the father of Indonesian economic and social development. No way, no discussion about this. He based his policy on a team. He was supported by a team of very competent economists, most of them formed in the United States, that launched the development process of Indonesia, and that made 5 to 10% economic growth a year. Poverty was reduced drastically from more than 70% in the 50s to less than 15% at the end of his reign in the late 90s. Just one, all these figures can be discussed, as you know very well, but the one that I'm always putting forward is life expectancy. Life expectancy in Indonesia improved by 15 years between 1966 and 1998. So people were only living up to about 50 years, in the late 60s, and it was 65 years in 1998. So there was this economic success, political repression, economic and social success. The regime collapsed, as you know, in 1998 after the Asian financial crisis, which hit many countries in Southeast Asia, Thailand first, but then Indonesia, and up to even down to Korea there. Indonesia was the hardest hit by the Asian financial crisis in 98. There was a strong recession, minus 13% in 1998, 99. And since the only legitimacy of this political regime, of this authoritarian political regime, was delivering development, and since development was not there anymore, the regime lost its legitimacy. And of course, during the 32 years, political pressure has accumulated, in the oven, basically. And when there was this economic crisis, the whole thing exploded, basically, and the regime collapsed, and Suharto resigned in 1998.
Okay. Reformism movement is considered as one of the important moments in Indonesia's political history. So, how did the Reformism movement in Indonesia respond to the challenges of democratization during that particular time period, and what were the major achievements and shortcomings of this process?
So, it's always the same. When a country has been living under an authoritarian rule for so long, when the things are collapsing, it is also a political and economic disaster, because all the things that were, cooking in the oven basically are really exploding. And for about 6 years, Indonesia was in big turmoil from 98 to 2004, basically. There was a very difficult transition to democracy, basically. The country almost exploded. Rebellions burst in many provinces of the country, violence, religious and communalist conflicts in many parts, in many provinces, in Aceh, North Sumatra, in Kalimantan, also Borneo, in the Maluku, in Papua, and many problems exploded. And it was a miracle that Indonesia survived between these 6 years, because as I said, it is a very diverse country, and then diversity was coming back to the fore. Plus, at the same time, Islamist terrorism developed at the same time, with the links with Al-Qaeda mostly, and there were terrorist attempts, several of them. The most well-known is the one that happened in Bali in 2002, where 200 people were killed in a bar, in Kuta. So it was difficult time, basically. Instability. Indonesia has had only 2 presidents since its independence, Sukarno from 45 to 66 and Suharto from 66 to 98. And then in 6 years, Indonesia had 3 presidents. Habibie, and for 1 year only, he was Suharto's vice president. So when Suharto resigned, by the constitution, he became the president, but he had not much of legitimacy. But I will talk about him again because he played a key role in the democratic process of the country. Then Gus Dur, which was a very respected Islamist, very moderate Islamist scholar. He stayed in power only for 2 years, and he was replaced by his vice president, who is Megawati Sukarno Putri. Then we come to a problem that I will mention later, that is nepotism, because Megawati is the daughter of Sukarno, and in Indonesia, as in all the rest of Asia, nepotism and dynasticism is playing a big role in politics, basically. Exactly. You know that in Pakistan also. Exactly. So there was this political instability, but democracy slowly but surely got ground and sustained, basically. This is where I want to talk about Habibie, because this guy was, the vice president of Suharto, and he had no real political legitimacy, and he was in power for only 1 year, but he was the one to pass most of the laws that launched Indonesia on the path of democratization. Decentralization laws, very, very deep decentralization to the district level. Of course, the civil rights were reinstalled, press freedom, political rights were reinstalled. There were 100 and more political parties which were formed, in a couple of months, after the collapse of the Suharto regime. But so Habibie played a very important role, and I think history will remind that at one stage. Yeah. But the 2 others, Gus Dur, Abdurrahman Wahid, was known, his nickname was Gus Dur, or Megawati Sukarno Putri, played also their role, and among other things, pushed the army back into the barracks, because the army was having a very important role in parliament. They had 100 and a large number, I don't remember exactly the number of assigned seats, so they were, brought back to the barracks, and it was an important moment. So in 2004, basically, Indonesia emerged, having overcome these difficult years, and then what helped also was that on the economic side, development was back. After these 2 years of difficulty linked to the Asian financial crisis, economic growth was back to the 5%, average a year, and poverty reduction took again the direction of the decrease, basically. So this is, how these 6 years basically put the country on the path of democracy, and as I said before, democracy has sustained, has remained until then, since then. Sorry.
Okay. How would you assess the state of democratic consolidation in Indonesia since 2004? And what are the prospects for maintaining and strengthening democratic institutions and practices?
So there, since 2004, one must distinguish two different decades, basically, under two different presidents, who basically, there was strong political stability, because after what I said, during the first 6 years of democracy, large political instability, three presidents. Then Indonesia has had two presidents since then. The first one, he has a very long name, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who was a general, a moderate general, which was not too much involved in the New Order regime of Suharto, and not too much involved also in corruption issues, etc., because the Suharto regime was very much corrupted. Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was president from 2004 to 2014. He was re-elected. The Indonesian constitution allows for 2 mandates only. He was re-elected a second time, and he stayed in power for 10 years. And then since 2014, there was Joko Widodo, who is the present president, was re-elected. It was elected, sorry, in 2014 and re-elected in 2019. So one must distinguish these two decades, because under SBY, I would say from 2000, under his first mandate, basically, in the democratization process continued to deepen, basically. The fight against corruption, there was a commission which was created to fight against corruption. There were laws that were passed for democratic and civil rights, etc. So one witnessed some sort of democratic consolidation during this first phase, this first mandate at all levels, the rule of law, press freedom, as I said, etc. But during the second mandate of Susilo, he was in a sense obliged to make political alliance for his re-election, etc. And there was the rise of radical Islamist parties, rather marginal, basically, but important and powerful, and groups also, radical Muslim groups, which started to launch a process of religious intolerance, basically. So during the second mandate of SBY, it's called by his initials, SBY, there was this return to some sort of religious intolerance, mostly towards the Shiite minority, because Indonesian Islam is dominantly Sunnite, but against the Shiite or against the Ahmadiyya movement. There is an Ahmadiyya movement, it was created by Ahmadi, who was Pakistani at the origin. So there is this movement who was there were demonstrations, and the places where they had their meetings, etc., were burned, etc. So there was, and also against the Christians. There's a strong Christian minority in Indonesia, about say 10% of the population, both Catholic and Protestant, and there was this resurge of religious intolerance. Then SBY finished his mandate in this sort of less favorable atmosphere, and Joko Widodo was elected. And the 2014 elections took place in a very nasty atmosphere. There was, again, this polarization in the political life of the country between those who were in favor of democracy. Jokowi was a member of the Democratic Party of Indonesia, and against him there was a guy called Prabowo Subianto, who was a candidate for the presidency. And Prabowo was a general. He was also at some stage Suharto's son-in-law. He had married one of his daughters, etc. And he was involved in all sorts of bad things that happened during the New Order regime in many places in Aceh or in Timor. I didn't talk about the fact that Indonesia seized the island of Timor for some time. So the Muslim, the more radical Muslim movement of the country supported Prabowo and his authoritarian. Basically, his project was going back to the New Order, re-establishing the New Order, basically. But fortunately, it was Jokowi who won, but in a very nasty and polarized and conflictual atmosphere. And during the first 2 years of his mandate, he was in a bad position, basically, to establish his authority. So he decided to fight, as one of my colleagues, Marcus Mitzner, who is a professor at ANU in Canberra, in Australia, has put it in a very beautiful article, fighting fighting illiberalism by illiberalism, basically. And Jokowi started to take to support from the army and to take measures against this Islamic movement, etc. So there was a sort of, as some scholars have called it, the beginning of democratic stagnation and the beginning of a democratic decline since 2016, 17 especially. 2017 was a very bad year because there was a strong conflict, especially in Jakarta, where the two factions fought for the post of the governor of the city of Jakarta. So I cannot go into the details here. But basically that was the case. And then the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, put some more into this, because as everywhere in the world, the COVID pandemic has been as a sort of been detrimental to democracy. All the countries in the world adopted rules and regulations and imposed a number of things that were basically don't move, don't go there, don't talk, etc. Press freedom, don't talk about a number of things. So this movement, this trend towards a sort of democratic decline increased a little bit during the COVID-19. In spite of that, I must say that democracy seems to be resilient in Indonesia. For instance, the last thing that is very important, the counterpower, basically, the checks and balances are still playing a very important role. The Constitutional Court, has been very active in forbidding a number of laws that were passed in a haste because of the COVID-19 situation, for instance. And more importantly, there was a strong movement supporting Jokowi to be re-elected for a third term, but the constitution doesn't allow for that. It's only 2 mandates for the president. And Jokowi resisted this move. The next the election will take place, presidential and legislative election will take place next February and 24. And so far, so good. I mean, Jokowi will stick to the 2 mandates and will not do, as we've seen in so many other countries of the world. Once the president is in charge, he remains forever, basically. Yeah, we've seen that in Africa very regularly. So basically, I would say that so far, Indonesian democracy remains resilient. And of course, it's a good example for the rest of the world.
Okay, my last question is based on the analysis of Indonesia's historical experience with development, democracy, and dictatorship. What potential lessons can be drawn for other Muslim majority countries who are grappling with similar issues of political transition and governance?
It is, of course, very difficult because each country has its own specific situation, history, etc. But I would say what's important, I have mentioned that earlier, the good luck that Indonesia had at the beginning to have a guy like Sukarno who invented this sort of unanimistic, syncretic ideology of Pancasila, which is probably largely responsible for the fact that Indonesia remained a unitary state in spite of its diversity. So this idea that having a very broad-based national ideology instead of insisting on one religion or the other, by the way, or one group or the other, is probably a good lesson for the rest of the world. Political leaders. Indonesia was lucky enough to have basically good political leaders. They all had their flaws and and their defaults, but basically all of them, and especially since the end of the authoritarian regime of Suharto. Suharto had a good thing. He was the father of Indonesian economic development, and of course we must recognize his deeds for that. But after him, all the people I mentioned, from Habibie to Jokowi, they've all been basically attached to the idea that Indonesia had become a democracy and defended the idea that it should remain a democracy. So that's also a lesson. Maybe also having been able, thanks maybe to the fact that Indonesia played a role in the non-aligned movement at the origin and remained in this position, not taking sides, basically. Indonesia continues to be, in favor of an independent and active foreign diplomacy and is not taking sides. And it is important because Indonesia is a member of the G20. and it is basically it is the only member, the only ASEAN member, the only member of the ASEAN regional grouping to be in the G20, where it represents basically the association, and it has an important economic, political role on the international scene, as we have seen in the last Bali summit in a couple of months ago, basically. So. It's a proof. What can I say? The lesson. It's a proof that Indonesia is a proof, shows that it is possible to have a relatively successful economic and social development, both under authoritarian rule, Suharto, and democratic rule since Suharto. So this is an interesting, but it is a good country to be. It is a good example for other Muslim countries, showing that democracy can work, that democracy can stay, can deliver progress, basically, can deliver economic and social progress to its population, in spite of all the problems that Indonesia can have today. The large majority of the population remains favorable to democracy and is not wishing to go back to some sort of authoritarian rule, like, unfortunately, in other countries, including in some European countries, as you know. And Jokowi, the present president, in spite of the COVID, in spite of a number of issues, remains very popular. He's probably one of the most popular leaders in the world today, with 75 to 80% rate of approval after 9 years in power in a complicated country like Indonesia. So it's an example, a good example that that democracy can work and can be resilient, basically. This being said, Indonesia is not the example, void of any defaults or problems or difficulties. As I said, nepotism is a problem because big dynastic families are, basically holding power since independence. Megawati Sukarno Putri is the daughter of Sukarno. She was president for some time, and now her daughter, Puan Maharani, will probably be a candidate to the next presidential election. Even Jokowi, who was coming from a very modest background, basically, was a small entrepreneur in a small town of Central Java, middle town of Central Java. And now that he's been in power for about 10 years, he's establishing his dynasty. His two sons are, one is already the governor, the mayor of Surakarta, the town where Jokowi was the mayor for a long time. And his second son is also running for elections, soon. So there is this problem. Corruption remains very high, and unfortunately, after having made progress, Indonesia is again, the last 2-3 years, corruption problems have been creeping out again. So there are problems. Democracy is not a dream, where everything is okay and functioning well. But it is, as you know, I was my good old professor Gilbert Etienne, who was a specialist of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, would always say that your good country were muddling through, basically. Yeah, he was talking about India muddling through. Well, Indonesia is muddling through, and Indonesian democracy is basically muddling through.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Professor Maurer. I really appreciate you coming on for this short interview. Thank you.
Thank you, Musanda. It was nice talking to you. Bye-bye. Let's keep in touch. Bye.